and today I wanted to talk to you about 5 short stories that will give you nightmares, freak you out, mindfuck you, leave you confused, leave you intrigued, leave you with lots of questions, make you, all of that good stuff. So I have 5 stories for you today. Oh, my glasses are so disgusting. I have 5 stories for you today. I'm going to save my favorite for last. You're going to judge me once you know what my favorite story is. But let's just start and make sure you stick around to the end to know which story is my all-time nightmare-evoking story. So let's just get started. Oh, my books here. I did some research for you. So the first story I want to talk to you about today is Shirley Jackson's The Lottery. This was written in 1948, and this one is quite interesting because in the first sentence we get this beautiful flowery language. So it says, the morning of June 27th was clear and sunny, with the fresh warmth of a full summer day. The flowers were blooming profusely, and the grass was richly green. So we get all of this beautiful language. And the first paragraph also mentions that there will be a lottery. Now, when we think of lottery, we think of like money, winning. So you're kind of left with this misconception that it's going to be a positive story. And the town members, the village, seem to be quite friendly with one another. Nothing really seems to be super eerie at first. So we're definitely left with like a false sense of security when starting this one. So now we're told about these traditions of this village and how they have changed throughout the years, but some things have always stayed the same. And we're going to come back and circle back to that in just a minute. There's an old man in the village, and he hears that other villages have already rid of the lottery, and he thinks that that's absolutely crazy, and he says that, the lottery must take place because that's the way that it's always been. Now, they use the lottery, this is where things get intense, they use the lottery to find a person in town to essentially be stoned to death by the other members of the village. And they do this each year. So here I have a quote for you. You know I like reading quotes. On page 43 it says, although the villagers had forgotten the ritual and lost the original black box, they still remembered to use stones. And so here's where we'll circle back to that, sort of like they keep the parts of the tradition that they feel are necessary, but then they rid of the other ones. In my opinion, it kind of seems like a comment on, just because something is a tradition doesn't necessarily mean it's a good thing, and it's okay to break tradition, it's okay to learn, it's okay to change as a community as a whole. I also really like it because we're left with this like very vague sense of when this story takes place. We have no idea where we are, we have no idea when we are, we just know that it's the June 27th or whatever it says. Which leads to a really interesting, I really like things that are ambiguous like that because the story is so well written and engaging. It can really be applied to so many different things across so many periods. And some argue that that's what good literature does. It stands the test of time. So now we're left with another question. Is this fair? I mean, technically, everybody has equal chance of getting stoned and dying. So is it fair that they're doing it this way? Do they need to do it? Do they do it because they have to? Or do they do it because that's just what they've been told? You really don't get any answers. And I think that's what makes the story so terrifying is like, we all go along with how we were raised, how we were told. But a lot of the times we don't stop to question like, wait a minute, why do we do this? That's kind of the message I think behind the story. It's really terrifying if you put yourself in the position of these people. I mean, there are children in town, there are mothers and fathers who have babies, and each one of them pulls a card to see if they get stoned each year, and it's really terrifying. So I think it's one of those stories that is equal parts terrifying, but obviously has a good message as well. And I really like this one. I think it's good. It doesn't have to be, blood and guts to be terrifying and to give you nightmares. So that is that one. The next one I want to talk to you about is Richard Hughes's The Ghost. Now this one was really difficult to find a publication date on, so I'm not actually sure where this was published. But let's go to this one because this one was fun. We start the story just in the middle of the action. So I want to read you the very first paragraph. It says, he killed me quite easily by bumping my head on the cobbles. Bang. Lord, what a fool I was. All my hate went out in that first bang. A fool to have kicked up such a fuss just because I had found him with another woman. And now he was doing this to me. Bang. That was the second one. And with it, everything went out. So we are told that a woman has confronted her cheating husband. In return, he has banged her head against the cobbles and murdered her. It's really funny because in the next paragraph, she's like, I'm gonna haunt his ass. And she starts following him down the street. She just feels drawn to him. There's something inside of her that's telling her, leave it alone, like whatever, you don't want to get him in trouble. Just leave it be and go to heaven. But she feels very drawn to continue to follow him. So she's like, I'm just gonna fuck with him for a little bit. So she starts being like, woo, like pretending to be a ghost. And people are opening up their windows like, who is that? What's going on down there? And so she knows other people can hear her, but her husband seems to be very like oblivious to her existence. He just keeps walking down the street, kind of smiling. And she's like, I don't understand. Why are you not listening to me? So she follows him for some time. Oh, one thing I will say is that I feel like the story is pretty fast-paced when you're reading it, and I feel like it's supposed to be to the speed of them walking down the street. Does that make sense? The way punctuation is used is to like evoke some sort of emotional or physical response in the reader. So for this one, it's fast-paced, like you're following them down the street, which I loved. So she continues to feel drawn to him, and he starts approaching a police station, and she's thinking, oh, this is it. You've screwed it up. Like you're gonna make him turn himself in. He's gonna get hanged. All of this stuff. And she doesn't want him to get in trouble, although he had murdered her. Now there's a huge twist at the end, and I'm going to ruin it for you, so put on some earmuffs if you don't want it to be ruined. But here is the last part of the story. So she's apologizing to John, her husband, you know, forgive me, I'm so sorry, I was just jealous, I was stupid. And the police take notice of her, and he says, that's her, done it with a hammer, she done it, brained him. But Lord, isn't her face ghastly, haunted like. Look at her head, poor girl. Looks as if she tried to do herself in with a hammer after. So then we find out that she isn't a ghost at all. Her husband didn't murder her. She murdered her husband with a hammer and then tried to hurt herself with the hammer. So at the end, you're just thrown so off because I did not see this coming. And you're like, okay, it makes sense. People did hear her. But then you're left with the thought of like, well, is her husband the ghost? Or is she hallucinating because she just tried to knock herself out with a hammer? It's a crazy story, and it's super short, like 3 or 4 pages. Really fun, and just one of those stories that you read and you're just like, you know what I'm talking about? Okay. Next up, let's talk about Flannery O'Connor. So just a little warning. As most of Flannery O'Connor's stories, there are racial slurs in this, so I just want to put that out there before. But this is a story written by Flannery O'Connor. It is called A Good Man is Hard to Find, and it was written in 1953. So this story is quite interesting. It's about a family who's going on a trip to Florida. The grandma is very self-centered and hypocritical, where she kind of thinks she's above everybody else and that like nobody is kind of up to her standards. The family's very disrespectful to her, and the children as well are very disrespectful to people outside of the family too. So she tries to encourage the family to not go to Florida because they'd already been to Florida. She wants to go to Tennessee. So the way that she does this is by telling her son that there's a man called the Misfit who's loose and has murdered people and robbed them, and he is supposedly headed towards Florida. So that's her way of getting her way, but everybody just ignores her, nobody has respect for her, so they're like, shut up grandma, let's go. There's a lot of foreshadowing of like death. Here's the thing, I love Flannery O'Connor stories because there's so much to analyze, and you could drive yourself crazy reading one story and being like, well, does it mean this, or does it mean that, or does it mean this? There's just so much that's below surface level, and I think that's the way that her stories are written. Nothing is how it seems. Everything is like a parallel to something or a metaphor for something. I will also say that there's a lot of religious symbolism, parallels, metaphors in her works, which I don't even pretend like I understand because I was not grown up in a religious setting and I'm not a Christian, so I don't understand a lot of the religious aspects of it, and I usually figure that out afterwards, kind of reading about the analysis of a story through somebody else's perspective. The grandma kind of takes it up a notch, and she wants to stop at this plantation that she had stopped at as a child, and her way of doing that is to lie to the children and tell them, oh, there's money buried somewhere, we should go try to find it. And the kids are like, yeah. Bug the father until the father's like, holy crap, fine, we'll stop, but like, shut up. And so they start driving on the dirt path, and the grandma starts kind of panicking because she realizes, oh wait, maybe that was in Tennessee where I saw that place. So she moves and she lets a cat that, again, she snuck into the car out of the cage, which attacks the driver of the car, her son. The car flips and people are hurt, and bones are broken and organs are ruptured, and everyone's just kind of dazed sitting at the side of the road. They see a car passing by, she waves it down, and guess who it is? It's the misfit and his cronies. So this story is heartbreaking because at the end, the misfit informs his friends to bring the family kind of like one by one into the woods and murder them until just the misfit and the grandma are left. And at first you see a lot of, what's the word? I guess like egotistical self-righteousness, where she's, you know, saying like, oh, no, you're not gonna kill me. Doesn't even really care about her family being murdered, but she's just like, you wouldn't kill an old woman, would you? You know, and kind of using her religion as a way to avoid death. And it's really interesting because the relationship between the misfit and the grandma, they have like something special goes on there. And it seems like by the end of the story, they both change a little bit because of the other's influence. They both evoke some sort of emotion from one another, and some change. And so the relationship there is really interesting. He ends up killing the grandmother. And then at the very end, you see the cat, the only survivor, rubbing at the legs of the misfit. Now this is an interesting point because the grandmother brought the cat along because there's no way the cat could survive 3 days without her. So again, she's like very, you know, obsessed with herself. You know, at the end, the cat is essentially a traitor and goes and rubs and befriends the man who murdered her. So really interesting story, and let's move on. Do you got a bear? Give me that bear. Oh, no, all my books. The next story that I want to talk about is Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper. This was written in 1892, and this one is just heartbreaking, truly. So we're introduced to a woman who believes that she's ill, but her brother and her husband, who are both physicians, tell her that she's fine, it's all in her head. But they also don't let her see her family. She's not allowed to do anything intellectual. She's not allowed to write. This just adds to like her isolation and emotional issues, you know? And it really just shows the difference between genders at this time and just the intensity of the patriarchy. So she says, I get unreasonably angry with John, her husband, sometimes. I'm sure I never used to be so sensitive. I think it is due to my nervous condition. I have a scheduled prescription for each hour in the day. He takes all care for me, and so I feel basely ungrateful not to value it. So because she's not adding to the relationship, she feels like she must go along with everything that he says. So they end up renting a house. He kind of forces her to stay in the top room, which she believes was a nursery for the children that had lived there before. There are bars on the window and other things that insinuate that it was a nursery with, you guessed it, yellow wallpaper. The story makes you think that she's suffering from postpartum depression. She's had a child and she really can't care for the child at the time, and she's having a lot of, you know, mental health struggles. And then just the thought of like a woman suffering from postpartum and being trapped in a nursery all day to kind of just marinate on that. There's just something so wrong in that. So she starts describing the yellow wallpaper, and she says, I never saw a worse paper in my life. It is dull enough to confuse the eye in following, pronounced enough to constantly irritate and provoke study, and when you follow the lame and certain curves for a little distance, they suddenly commit suicide, plunge off in outrageous angles, destroy themselves in unheard of contradictions. The color is repellent, revolting, a smoldering, unclean yellow, a sulfur tint. She also says that there's a recurrent spot where the pattern lolls like a broken neck and two bulbous eyes stare at you upside down. They crawl, absurd, unblinking eyes everywhere. I never saw so much expression in an inanimate object before. There's also some parallels, I think, between the character and the house itself. On the inside, it's, you know, damaged and dull and broken, and on the outside, the world around it is perfect and sunny and bright. And so it seems like kind of a parallel between her own struggles. Like on the inside, she feels so hurt, but everyone's telling her, oh, you're fine. Not only that, but it's kind of a true story. A lot of this is, not this specifically, but a lot of this is based off of the experience that Charlotte had when she had postpartum depression in the 19th century. So now she gets distracted by the wallpaper. She becomes obsessed with it, although she does hate it. So she'll stare at it for hours on end. And then this is interesting. So she talks to her husband about how she wants to visit her cousins, and he says, But he said I wasn't able to go nor able to stand it after I got there, and I did not make out a very good case for myself, for I was crying before I had finished. So her crying, showing emotion, is, in his eyes, irrational, which is just insane. So she starts being obsessed with this wallpaper. Then she says, and it is like a woman stooping down and creeping behind the patterns. I don't like it a bit. The faint figure behind seems to shake the patterns, just as if she wanted to get out. So now she's seeing a woman, and it looks like bars behind the wallpaper, only at night, because during the day the woman is out. So that's an interesting parallel as well, whereas, you know, when her husband's home, she's not allowed to express her feelings, she's not allowed to be herself, she's not allowed to write, she's not allowed to see anybody. And then when he's gone, she's allowed to go outside and explore, and that's where she sees the other woman that was locked behind the wallpaper creeping around during the day. So then, at the very end of the story, she tears down all the wallpaper and she says, I wonder if they all came out of the wallpaper as I did. So now she's seeing herself as one of those women she sees creeping around. The very last paragraph of the story, it says, I kept on creeping. Okay, so she locks herself in the room, she tears down all the wallpaper, and she says, and her husband's trying to break down the door, or does break down the door, I guess. She says, I kept on creeping just the same, but I looked at him over my shoulder. I've got out at last, said I, in spite of you and Jane, and I've pulled off most of the paper, so you can't put me back. Now, why should the man have fainted? But he did, and right across my path by the wall, so that I had to creep over him every time. Oh, that just creeps me out. That last line is so ugh. But now let's get to my favorite, because this one is fucked up. If you'll let me just explain why this story is important to me, and then we'll go from there. So, I took a creative writing class, and I talked about this in a previous video. Well, I have a degree in creative writing, but I was really stuck between two different degrees. I didn't know if I should continue on because I have an associate's degree in American Sign Language Interpreting, but I didn't know if I should transfer to the English department because I really had a love for them both. So I ended up becoming an English major, majoring in creative writing, and it was the best decision I ever made. My first creative writing class ever, I get handed this packet, which is a story that my teacher had given us. And let me just read the first line of this, and then I'll tell you why this was important to me. So this is called The Return, and this is by Roberto Bolano. Again, I have a hard time placing the publication date. I'm not really sure when this was written. But the very first paragraph is, I have good news and bad news. The good news is that there is a life of a kind after this life. The bad news is that Jean-Claude Villeneuve is a necrophiliac. So that's the first line of the story that I read in this creative writing class, and I'm thinking, there's no way that we're going to be reading horror stories in here. And then taking these classes just opened up a world to me of just like finding horror in everything, and knowing that there are, like, he was published in the New Yorker, and then he writes stories like this. Like, it's just, it made me be like, there is a place for you. Does that make sense? Anyways, I couldn't find the story for a long time. Obviously, that class was many, many years ago. And I kept telling my fiance, man, there's this story that keeps coming up in my head, and I remember reading it. And he's like, what's it about? I'm like, this necrophiliac, and I'm explaining it to him, and he's like, what the hell is going on? And when I decided to make this video, I was like, I have to find the story. So I went through all of my school stuff, and I found it, and I'm so excited, and I got to reread it, and it was fantastic. So let's just get into it. So that's the story. This story is interesting because we're introduced to the first sentence, and immediately we know what the story's about. There's not much else to the premise of the story, but we're kind of left to put the pieces together ourselves. So there's a man, he's 34, and he lives in Paris. He's told by his doctors to slow down, quit the partying, but he doesn't, and he ends up dying on a dance floor because of a heart attack. This is how his description of death. It was as if you've suddenly put on a pair of glasses that don't match your own prescription. They're not all that different, but not quite right. And the worst thing is, you know the glasses that you put on belong to you and nobody else. So that's his description of death. So at the time he dies, his girlfriend just runs off and he's left with nobody. So he just ends up following his corpse around. So he goes into the ambulance, they go to the hospital, and he's in the morgue. And he says, I would have never imagined that so many people would die in the course of an ordinary night in Paris. Which, I don't know, just stories about death, I think, make us kind of face our own mortality in like a morbid but lighthearted way. And it's lines like that where you're just like, oh, yeah, this happens all the time and it's gonna happen to me one day, and I don't even want to think about it, but I do because I'm reading this story. You know what I'm talking about. So he's sitting by his corpse in the morgue, and he says, I got to thinking about heaven and hell, reward and punishment, and I had a panic attack. But that bout of irrational fear was soon over. So it's interesting here because we see the same human emotions, and we're being told something different than what we've always been told death is. This beautiful, magical place. He's sitting with a bunch of dead bodies thinking about his past. And he says, so what I did was go on thinking about my past life and the enigmatic future, to give it a name of some sort, that lie before me. He notices that some orderlies are coming and taking his body, and he's like, well, where's my body going? So he follows them into a parking garage. They load his corpse into a car, and they arrive at a mansion. And when the door is opened, he finds that it is owned by the world-famous designer in Paris, Jean-Claude Villeneuve. I apologize if I'm saying that incorrectly. The body is left there for Jean-Claude. He takes it out of the body bag, and this is what the owner of the body says. He says, I stood up too, came a little closer, and saw my naked body, slightly fatter than I would have liked, but not too bad, eyes closed, an absent expression on my face. And he starts to wonder what this man will do to his body. I'm going to leave that for your interpretation, so you can read the story yourself. However, the next paragraph is hilarious. He says, my reactions were contradictory. I felt disgusted by what I was seeing, grateful for not having been sodomized, surprised to discover Villeneuve's secret, angry at the orderlies for having rented out my body, and even flattered to have served unwillingly as an object of desire for one of the most famous men in France. So he has like all these contradictory emotions in relation to the body. And now it's interesting because he ends up speaking out loud to Jean-Claude, and he says, it's Jean-Claude, right? Yeah. And he says, you should be ashamed of yourself. And Jean-Claude's like, who's there? And he can actually hear him. So they end up sitting and talking, and he explains like, hey, I'm the owner of the body. Jean-Claude apologizes, and he forgives him before he even apologizes. And it seems like he's kind of enamored by him because of perhaps his wealth, perhaps his standing in society, perhaps his success. It's kind of up in the air, but it seems that he's instantly enamored with him, and they end up being friends, and the orderlies come to take the body away, and he stays with Jean-Claude, and they continue talking. It's a very odd ending. However, it leaves me to wonder that is it a comment on kind of like socioeconomic status, where like if you're rich, if you have enough money, you can kind of get away with anything? Or is it a comment on complacency and humanity's ability to adapt in any such situation? Or is it just a morbid tale of necrophilia? I mean, really, you're the judge. You be the judge of this one. It's an interesting story. It's really messed up. Even a story as grotesque as this has some sort of meaning underneath, whether that's abundantly clear to the audience or not, or whether it was abundantly clear to the writer or not. I mean, I think there's a lot that you can pick apart about this. So those are my 5 short stories that will hopefully give you nightmares. I hope you guys check these out. I'm sure that you guys have read a few of them, The Lottery and The Yellow Wallpaper probably, but maybe the other ones you hadn't heard of, and let me know if you guys get a chance to read these. And also let me know, what is a short story that gives you nightmares? Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you tomorrow with yet another horror video. Bye guys.